Let's talk about what $47 billion looks like. It looks like a company worth more than Boeing was in 2019, more than Ford, more than the entire GDP of Paraguay. It looks like a valuation that serious, professional investors, people who manage trillions of dollars and have spent careers separating real value from manufactured stories, signed off on, wired money toward, and publicly defended with straight faces. Now let's talk about what $47 billion actually was in this specific case. It was a company that rented office space. That's it. That is the underlying business. WeWork signed long-term leases on commercial real estate, spent significant money fitting those spaces out with exposed brick and kombucha taps and phone booths and neon signs with motivational phrases on them, and then rented those same spaces back to individuals and small companies at a markup on short-term, flexible terms. This is called subletting. It is a business that has existed for decades, that operates in every major city in the world, that is generally valued by the financial markets at somewhere between 6 and 9 times earnings. WeWork, at its peak valuation, was valued at over 14 times its annual revenue. Not its earnings, its revenue, in a year when it lost $1.9 billion. So how does a subletting company get valued like a technology company? How do investors worth hundreds of billions of dollars collectively agree to call a real estate operation a physical social network and price it accordingly? How does a man who named himself and his wife as the potential spiritual leaders of the world in his own company's founding documents raise $18.5 billion from the most sophisticated capital allocators in Asia and America? And how, when the whole thing starts to come apart, when the numbers are finally examined with the skepticism they deserved years earlier, does a company worth $47 billion become worth essentially nothing in the span of about 6 weeks? This is the WeWork story. It is a story about money, but it's really a story about belief, about how belief gets manufactured, sold, and then spectacularly, publicly, painfully withdrawn. Pull up a chair. This one requires you to check your own investment decisions when you're done. Every great con, and we will come back to whether WeWork was a con or simply a catastrophic miscalculation, needs a protagonist with the right combination of charisma, audacity, and willingness to speak in a register that makes ordinary people feel like they're in the presence of something extraordinary. Adam Neumann was born in Tel Aviv in 1979 and spent a portion of his childhood on a kibbutz, the communal living arrangement that is itself a kind of deliberately designed alternative to conventional capitalism, a community where shared resources and shared labor and shared purpose replace individual ownership and competition. This biographical detail matters, not because Neumann was shaped by it in the ways he later claimed, but because he was very good at invoking it. The kibbutz gave him a vocabulary of community, of shared mission, of something larger than the transactional. He could speak about collective purpose without sounding fake, because he had grown up in a version of it. He came to New York in the early 2000s, studied at Baruch College, and began trying to build businesses with the particular energy of someone who has decided that the gap between his ambitions and his current situation is a temporary problem, rather than a reflection of his actual capabilities. His early ventures were not remarkable. He sold collapsible heels for women's shoes. He ran a baby clothes company called Crawlers that had knee pads sewn into the knees for babies who crawl. These were not businesses that announced the arrival of someone who would redefine capitalism. But Neumann was learning something in those early years that was more valuable than any product idea. He was learning how to be in a room, how to speak about what he was doing in terms that made it sound like the most important thing happening anywhere. How to make the person across from him feel that being part of whatever Adam Neumann was building was not just a financial decision, but a statement about who they were and what they believed in. He was developing what the business world often calls founder charisma, but which is, in its purest form, something closer to a talent for evangelical persuasion. The meeting that changed everything happened around 2008, when Neumann connected with Miguel McKelvey, an architect from Oregon with a genuine gift for creating physical spaces that felt warm and alive and intentional. McKelvey was the yin to Neumann's yang, the builder to Neumann's visionary, the person who could take the environments Neumann was describing in the air and actually construct them on floors and walls and ceilings. Together, they began working on a concept for a shared workspace. The specific origin story has been told in multiple versions, the way origin stories always are when they've been polished for investor presentations and magazine profiles. What's consistent across the versions is this. Neumann and McKelvey identified something real in the shifting landscape of work. The rise of the freelance economy, the growth of startups that didn't want to sign 5-year leases, the cultural shift toward work environments that felt less like offices and more like the coffee shops where people had started preferring to work. These were genuine trends, genuinely underserved by the commercial real estate industry's traditional offerings. In 2010, WeWork was founded. The first location opened in Soho, Manhattan. The space was beautiful. Exposed brick, high ceilings, natural light, common areas designed to encourage the kind of spontaneous interaction and cross-pollination of ideas that Neumann had already begun describing as the company's core value proposition. Not a desk, not even a workspace, a community, a platform for human connection. A physical manifestation of the belief that the way people work together could be transformed if someone designed the environment right. People came, they liked it, they paid for it, and Neumann looked at the people paying for it and felt something that would become the engine of WeWork's rise and its eventual destruction. He felt that he was onto something much, much larger than what he'd built. The question was whether the something larger was a business or a story. The trick at the center of WeWork's rise, the specific rhetorical and strategic move that transformed a profitable niche business into a venture capital sensation, was the reclassification of what the company actually was. WeWork was not, Neumann insisted with evangelical certainty, a real estate company. Real estate companies sign leases and rent space. Real estate companies are valued at boring multiples of boring earnings. Real estate companies are not the kind of thing that attracts venture capital, because venture capital is looking for technology businesses, scalable, asset-light, high-margin operations whose costs don't rise linearly with their revenue. WeWork, Neumann argued, was a technology company. More specifically, it was a community company. Even more specifically, it was a platform. A physical platform, yes, but a platform nonetheless, connecting people and companies in ways that generated network effects and compounding value. Here's the thing about that argument. It is not entirely stupid. A conventional office rental company has a relatively simple value proposition: space for money. WeWork was doing something slightly different. It was curating the experience of that space in ways that its members genuinely valued. The events it hosted, the introductions it facilitated, the sense of being part of something larger than your own tiny desk. These had real value for freelancers and small companies who found conventional office environments alienating. The product was genuinely better than what it replaced. But slightly better than a conventional office rental company and technology platform with unlimited scale potential are very different valuations. And Neumann, with extraordinary skill and commitment, insisted on the second framing in every room he entered. The pitches he gave to potential investors in the early years are almost mythological in Silicon Valley and investment banking circles. Neumann did not present a financial model and answer questions about unit economics. He gave experiences. He took investors to WeWork spaces and let the environment do the work. He talked about the kibbutz. He talked about his children and the world he wanted them to inherit. He talked about consciousness and energy and the power of human connection. He talked about making the world a better place in terms so cosmic that questioning the lease structure felt like missing the point. And he had real numbers to point to. WeWork was growing fast, genuinely fast. New locations were opening at a pace that made investors' eyes widen. Revenue was scaling. Membership was growing. The product had been validated in New York and was working in San Francisco and London and Chicago. The underlying demand for flexible office space was real and accelerating. The story Neumann told wasn't fictional. It was built on a foundation of actual traction. The problem that would take years and billions of dollars to surface fully, was in the unit economics. In simple terms, was each individual WeWork location actually making money? The answer, examined closely, was troubling. WeWork signed long-term leases, typically 10 to 15 years, committing to large, fixed monthly payments to building owners, regardless of how many members were paying to use the space. It then spent significant capital, in the range of hundreds of dollars per square foot, fitting out those spaces to the WeWork standard. And then it rented the space on flexible terms, month to month in many cases, at rates that needed to be high enough to cover both the lease costs and the fit-out costs, and generate a margin. In a fully occupied location, with construction costs amortized over time, this could work. In a new or underperforming location, the losses were substantial. WeWork was opening new locations at a rate that meant the portfolio always contained a large number of immature, loss-generating spaces. This would have been fine, even expected, if the nature of the losses were investments in future profitability. But the losses weren't shrinking as locations matured. The fundamental economics of the individual location model were not improving with scale in the way that technology platform economics improve with scale. Each new location was in many respects a new bet, a new long-term lease commitment, a new fit-out cost, a new membership ramp-up period, and the portfolio kept getting bigger while profitability kept being deferred. Neumann's solution to this was not to fix the unit economics. It was to grow fast enough that the story of future profitability remained plausible. More locations meant more revenue. More revenue meant the losses, while growing in absolute terms, shrank as a percentage of a larger number. The narrative was velocity. Growth justified everything. And to sustain the growth, you needed capital. And to raise the capital, you needed the valuation. And to sustain the valuation, you needed the story. And the story was Neumann. The whole structure depended on the story holding. And holding it required someone with an almost superhuman ability to make people believe. In December 2016, Masayoshi Son, the founder and CEO of SoftBank, the Japanese technology conglomerate whose investment instincts had produced both the greatest investment in venture capital history, a $20 million bet on Alibaba that became worth $130 billion, and some of the most spectacular losses. SoftBank lost more than $70 billion in the dot-com collapse, flew to New York. The visit lasted 12 minutes. That is not a figure of speech. By some accounts, the meeting in which Son decided to invest $4.4 billion in WeWork lasted approximately 12 minutes. Son toured a WeWork space, he spoke with Neumann. Something in the interaction, the energy of the space, Neumann's presentation, the collision of Son's investment philosophy with Neumann's cosmic ambition clicked into place with a speed that bypassed the kind of due diligence that $4.4 billion typically requires. Son later described his investment philosophy in terms that sound, to conventionally trained financial analysts, like something between insight and madness. He made decisions based on his gut feeling about whether a founder had the animal smell of a winner, a Japanese phrase he used to describe a quality of energy and drive that he believed was predictive of success at the largest scale. He was looking for people who thought not in years, but in decades, who could project their vision 30 years forward and describe what the world would look like. Neumann, who had already demonstrated an ability to speak about 30-year visions with remarkable conviction, passed that test with considerable room to spare. The $4.4 billion investment valued WeWork at approximately $20 billion. In a single conversation, over a single tour, the company's implied valuation had doubled from its previous round. Son later said he wished he could have invested even more. He scrawled a note to Neumann on a napkin, or some similarly informal medium, depending on the telling, that reportedly contained the message that in a fight, it was better to be crazy than smart. and that Son wanted Neumann to be crazier. Neumann did not need to be told. The SoftBank investment was not just money, it was signal. In the venture capital ecosystem, where the credibility of your investors is itself a component of your company's value, having Masayoshi Son, the man whose Alibaba bet was the stuff of investment legend, stamp his approval on WeWork was transformational. Other investors who had been cautious suddenly found reasons to participate. Investment banks that had been skeptical about WeWork's valuation framework found language to accommodate it. The herd moved, as herds do, toward the direction that the most credible participant had indicated. By 2019, SoftBank had invested a total of approximately $18.5 billion in WeWork across multiple rounds. The Vision Fund, SoftBank's $100 billion investment vehicle, itself funded largely by sovereign wealth from Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi, was the primary vehicle for this commitment. WeWork was Vision Fund's largest single investment, which meant that the proposition that WeWork was worth tens of billions of dollars was not just Adam Neumann's pitch anymore. It was the basis of Masayoshi Son's flagship investment product. Two men, both with extraordinary records of sometimes genius and sometimes catastrophic judgment, had decided together that WeWork was worth something between $40 and $50 billion. The market was watching. The competitive pressure on other investors to either get in or explain why they were staying out was intense. And the man at the center of all of it was enjoying his position in ways that were becoming, to the people closest to the company, alarming. Because the story of WeWork is not just the story of a bad investment thesis. It is the story of what happens when the person executing the thesis has no meaningful check on his behavior. Let's be specific about some things, because the specificity is important. These are not allegations or rumors. These are documented facts that emerged from the IPO filing, from SEC investigations, from journalistic accounts by people who reported them on the record, and from legal proceedings. Adam Neumann sold the We trademark to WeWork for $5.9 million. His own company bought his trademark from him, the We in WeWork. He had registered it as a personal trademark, and then, when the company rebranded its parent entity as the We Company, the company paid him nearly $6 million for the right to use a word that is, in most dictionary definitions, a pronoun. He used a corporate jet, which WeWork leased, for personal trips, including trips to his surf house in the Hamptons, international vacations, and on one occasion, a flight to Israel, during which sources report that a significant quantity of marijuana was stashed in cereal boxes on the plane, which was then discovered by the crew, creating an incident that the company's own documentation references. The marijuana, reportedly, was not left behind. He borrowed hundreds of millions of dollars from WeWork, using his WeWork shares as collateral, a practice that allowed him to extract real cash from the company's theoretical value, essentially monetizing the inflated valuation in ways that didn't require selling shares, which would have signaled lack of confidence, and that left him significantly liquid in ways that ordinary shareholders weren't. He sold approximately $700 million worth of WeWork shares in secondary transactions before the IPO, cashing out nearly $750 million from a company that had never turned a profit and was losing money at an accelerating rate. This is legal. It is not unusual for founders to sell some shares. The scale of it, $700 million from a company burning through capital at that rate, was unusual. His wife, Rebecca Paltrow Neumann, a cousin of actress Gwyneth Paltrow, held the title of Chief Brand and Impact Officer and was, according to multiple accounts from employees, deeply influential in hiring and firing decisions, including the termination of several employees based on what sources described as her sense of their energy. The WeWork S-1 filing, which was the document the company submitted ahead of its planned IPO, included language granting Rebecca Neumann the right to select Adam's successor if he were incapacitated, a provision that had no precedent in the governance documents of any publicly traded American corporation. The couple's vision for WeWork had, by 2019, expanded to include ambitions that the S1 document attempted to describe in language that read, to many professional investors who reviewed it, as either inspirational or delusional, depending on your disposition. The document described WeWork's mission as to elevate the world's consciousness. It described Neumann as having a goal of living forever. It included a section on WeWork's impact metrics that attempted to quantify the company's value in terms of community-adjusted EBITDA, a metric that the company had invented that no standard accounting framework recognized and that produced numbers dramatically more favorable than the conventional EBITDA figures, which were deeply negative. Community-adjusted EBITDA is worth pausing on because it is a genuinely remarkable document of the era. The metric took WeWork's standard losses and then added back not just depreciation and amortization, as EBITDA normally does, but also pre-opening costs, the costs of new markets, and various other line items that WeWork categorized as growth investments rather than operating costs. The effect was to take a company losing $1.9 billion per year and present a version of its economics that looked almost like a real business. Professional investors who had spent careers reading financial statements looked at this metric and felt a specific sensation, the sensation of being treated as if they were stupid, the sensation of a company putting a new label on a loss and expecting the label to change the nature of the number underneath it. The S1, when it was filed in August 2019, was supposed to be the document that carried WeWork from private unicorn to public company. Instead, it was the document that cracked the story open. Because the public markets, unlike the private markets, could not be asked to simply believe. August 14th, 2019, WeWork's IPO registration statement, the S1, becomes public. And what follows over the next several days is one of the most extraordinary moments of collective analytical reckoning in the history of financial markets. Investment analysts, journalists, short sellers, accounting professors, startup lawyers, and ordinary individuals with spreadsheet skills read the document and respond in a way that is almost uniformly devastating. Not because the underlying business model is obviously fraudulent, it isn't, but because the gap between how WeWork was describing itself and what the numbers in its own filing actually showed is so large, so brazen, and so poorly concealed that the reaction ranges from incredulity to genuine outrage. The losses. The $1.9 billion net loss in 2018. The accelerating cash burn. The disclosure that WeWork had $47 billion in long-term lease obligations while holding significantly less in assets, meaning the company had committed to paying enormous amounts of money in the future from capital it didn't have and from a business model whose profitability had not been demonstrated. The related party transactions, loans to Neumann, the trademark purchase, properties that Neumann owned personally and leased back to WeWork at rates that created obvious conflicts of interest. The governance structure. The dual-class share structure that gave Neumann 20 votes per share versus 1 vote per share for ordinary investors, meaning that no matter how many shares the public bought, Neumann could never be removed by a shareholder vote. The provision giving Rebecca Neumann successor selection rights. The board composition that included Neumann's wife and close allies with minimal independent oversight. The language. Oh, the language. The S1 used the word community 150 times. It described WeWork as a physical social network. It included the elevate the world's consciousness mission statement. It described the company as existing at the intersection of technology and physical spaces in ways that would have been more convincing if the document hadn't also revealed that the vast majority of revenue came from renting desks. Scott Galloway, a professor at NYU's Stern School of Business and a commentator on technology and business, whose willingness to say uncomfortable things loudly had made him a significant voice in the space, published a detailed takedown of the S1 that circulated widely. He called WeWork the most ridiculous IPO of 2019, a year that included several other candidates, and argued that the company was worth approximately $10 billion, not the $47 billion it was seeking. His analysis was specific, systematic, and devastating. He was not alone. The Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, Bloomberg, and dozens of independent analysts produced similar assessments. The IPO Roadshow, the series of investor presentations that companies conduct before a public offering, was a disaster. Institutional investors who had been willing to value WeWork at $47 billion in private markets, where the information was controlled and the social dynamics of a room with Neumann in it could do a lot of work, had a very different reaction when forced to engage with the numbers on paper in the cold light of mandatory public disclosure. Questions about the unit economics got direct, uncomfortable answers. Questions about the governance structure got defensive responses. Questions about community-adjusted EBITDA got answers that satisfied nobody. The target valuation for the IPO began to drop from $47 billion to $20 billion to somewhere in the range of $10 to $12 billion. And even at $10 billion, the institutional book, the orders from investors committing to buy shares, was not being filled at the levels required to proceed. WeWork was running out of road. The company had been burning through cash at a rate that made its reserves dangerously slim. It needed the IPO capital to survive. And the IPO, now that the world could see the numbers, was not going to happen at any price that the existing investors, particularly SoftBank, could accept without acknowledging losses of catastrophic magnitude. Something had to give, and what gave was Adam Neumann. The collapse of Adam Neumann's position at WeWork happened with a speed that was genuinely stunning, given how long and how thoroughly the conditions for it had been building. On September 24, 2019, 40 days after the S-1 was filed, and in the middle of a roadshow that had turned into a public humiliation, Adam Neumann resigned as CEO of WeWork. He did not go quietly. The negotiation over the terms of his departure was itself a story of extraordinary financial scale. Neumann, protected by governance documents he had written specifically to entrench his own power, was in a negotiating position that should have been weak. The company was in crisis, the IPO was failing, his behavior had been documented and found catastrophic by every serious analysis, but which, because of the way the stock and board structure worked, was actually quite strong. Removing him required his cooperation. His cooperation required compensation. The deal that SoftBank negotiated to remove Neumann from WeWork became one of the most discussed transactions in Silicon Valley history. SoftBank paid Neumann approximately $185 million in consulting fees for a one-year consulting agreement. SoftBank purchased approximately $970 million of Neumann's shares, buying them from him at a premium, removing his financial position from the company, and giving him cash to replace the paper wealth that was evaporating. The package also included a $500 million credit facility. Total value of the deal to exit a CEO whose company was collapsing? Approximately $1.7 billion. For context, this is the outcome for the person most directly responsible for the catastrophe. The investors who had committed money to WeWork at high valuations, the pension funds, the university endowments, the sovereign wealth funds that had put capital into SoftBank's Vision Fund, were facing losses of billions. The employees of WeWork, who held stock options that were now worthless, were facing the evaporation of compensation they had been counting on. The rank-and-file workers, many of whom would be laid off in the mass restructuring that followed, were facing unemployment. Adam Neumann was getting $1.7 billion. The reaction in the startup and venture capital community was immediate and divided along predictable lines. Critics called it an obscenity, a conclusive demonstration that the system was structured to protect founders and major investors at the expense of everyone else, regardless of the outcomes their decisions produced. Defenders noted that contractual obligations were contractual obligations, that the governance documents Neumann had in place were standard, if extreme, products of the venture capital era's founder-friendly norms, and that the alternative, a prolonged legal battle with an entrenched founder who had the legal right to resist, might have produced even worse outcomes for the company. Both arguments had merit. Neither made the optics any less stark. In November 2019, WeWork laid off approximately 2,400 employees, roughly 20% of its workforce. The layoffs came with limited severance in many cases, and the stock options that had constituted a significant portion of many employees' expected compensation were worthless. The company canceled employee healthcare benefits the day many of the layoffs took effect, a decision so tone-deaf that it had to be reversed within days after the public reaction. The company that had been the most aggressively marketed emblem of the new economy, the place where you came to work in a community, to be part of a mission, to build something that elevated human consciousness, was now conducting mass layoffs in the middle of a financial crisis that its own leadership had created and then been paid $1.7 billion to leave. And the man who had started the whole thing was sitting on a beach somewhere with more than enough money to never think about it again.
Masayoshi Son stood in front of SoftBank shareholders in November 2019 and delivered a presentation that included a slide describing his WeWork investment as a misjudgment. He used that word specifically. Not a fraud, not a systemic failure, a misjudgment. He was not wrong that it was a misjudgment, but the word did considerable work to minimize what had actually happened. SoftBank's Vision Fund had invested approximately $18.5 billion in WeWork. By the time the IPO failed and the rescue package was assembled, the Vision Fund's carrying value of its WeWork stake had been written down from that $18.5 billion to approximately $7.8 billion, a loss, on paper, of roughly $10 billion in a single quarter. It would eventually write down much further. The full extent of SoftBank's WeWork losses would ultimately exceed $14 billion. $14 billion, lost on a single investment, in a company that, when examined with the scrutiny that $14 billion deserved before it was committed, would have revealed the fundamental mismatch between its story and its economics almost immediately. The question that Son's misjudgment framing didn't answer, the question that institutional investors, journalists, and people inside SoftBank were asking quietly, was whether the Vision Fund model itself was broken. Not just the WeWork investment, the model. The Vision Fund was structured around a specific thesis, that deploying enormous amounts of capital into technology-adjacent companies very quickly and at premium valuations would create self-fulfilling momentum that produced category-defining winners. If you gave Uber more money than any competitor could raise, Uber would win. If you gave WeWork more money than any flexible office company could raise, WeWork would win. The scale of the capital was itself the competitive weapon. This thesis produced results in some cases, but it also produced WeWork. It produced situations where companies received capital so far in excess of their demonstrated business model that it funded growth without accountability, where the money arrived so fast and in such quantities that the discipline of earning your next round, of proving your unit economics before being allowed to scale, was bypassed entirely. The Vision Fund had, in several cases, essentially written a check large enough to exempt the recipient from the normal rules of business. The consequences of that exemption were not limited to WeWork. Across the Vision Fund portfolio, Uber, Oyo, Katera, Brandless, Fair.com, and others, the pattern of massive capital commitment, rapid scaling, and deeply problematic unit economics was visible in multiple cases. WeWork was the most dramatic, but it was not an anomaly. It was a case study in what the Vision Fund model looked like at its most extreme. For the limited partners in the Vision Fund, the Saudi and Abu Dhabi sovereign wealth funds that had contributed the majority of its capital, the WeWork implosion was an uncomfortable test of the due diligence they had conducted before committing. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's Public Investment Fund had committed $45 billion to SoftBank's Vision Fund, effectively trusting Son's judgment at a scale that required either extraordinary confidence or limited independent analysis. The WeWork outcome did not enhance confidence. Son himself absorbed the largest financial loss of his career. His personal net worth, which had been partially built on the rising valuation of his SoftBank stake, declined by billions. He gave presentations that were unusually candid for a figure of his stature about the scale of what had happened. He admitted to being seduced by Neumann's charisma,
He acknowledged that he had failed to apply the analytical discipline that the investment required.
The humility was notable. It was also, from the perspective of the people who had lost jobs, options, and healthcare, somewhat beside the point. Because the real reckoning wasn't financial, it was structural. WeWork did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in an ecosystem, a specific set of cultural, financial, and institutional conditions that had been building for over a decade, and that had created the perfect environment for a company whose story was better than its economics to raise $18.5 billion. Let's call that ecosystem by its name: the late-stage venture capital culture of the 2010s. The decade that produced WeWork also produced Theranos, Uber's IPO at a $120 billion valuation, followed by years of losses, Lyft's rapid decline after going public, the general phenomenon of unicorn companies, private companies valued at over $1 billion, whose valuations reflected investor enthusiasm rather than demonstrated financial performance. It produced a culture in which founder-friendly had become a quasi-religious principle, in which the instinct to challenge a founder's judgment was seen as evidence of limited vision rather than appropriate diligence, in which the social dynamics of venture capital, where the worst outcome is missing the next Google and the risk of overinvestment is socialized while the returns are private, created systematic pressure toward credulity. The specific mechanism that enabled WeWork's valuation to reach $47 billion without meaningful scrutiny was the structure of the private market. When you invest in a public company, the company's financials are mandatory, standardized, audited, and publicly available. Any analyst with a Bloomberg terminal can build a model. The price is set by thousands of independent buyers and sellers, each with their own information and incentives, arriving at a consensus in real time. Private markets work differently. Information is asymmetric. The company controls what investors see and when they see it. Valuations are set in negotiations between the company and a small number of investors, not by market consensus. The social dynamics of investment rounds, where following a reputable lead investor provides cover and missing a hot deal is the cardinal sin, create pressure that sometimes overwhelms independent judgment. And the carried interest structure, where venture capital fund managers take a percentage of profits, creates incentives to mark portfolio companies upward rather than downward in interim valuations, regardless of whether the fundamentals support it. WeWork exploited all of these dynamics. The information it provided to investors was curated, controlled, and presented in the most favorable possible light. The lead investor, SoftBank, the most credible technology investor in Asia, provided cover for everyone who followed. The narrative was so powerfully constructed and Neumann's charisma in delivery was so effective that the social cost of saying, "I don't believe this," in a room full of people who did, was a real and significant barrier. There were people who said it anyway. There were analysts at major investment banks who wrote internal memos raising questions about WeWork's unit economics years before the S1. There were venture capital firms that passed on every round. There were journalists who published skeptical pieces that circulated in financial circles without producing the reckoning that the evidence warranted. The information was available. The conclusion was available. The problem was the incentive structure. Who bears the cost of being right versus who bears the cost of being wrong? In venture capital, being wrong about a company that everyone else believed in is a defensible error. Being the person who passed on the next Google is not. This asymmetry produces systematic bias toward participation and systematic underweighting of skepticism, even when that skepticism is warranted. WeWork is the case study of what that bias looks like when it reaches its most extreme expression. And it left behind something that changed, at least for a time, the way the industry thought about what it had built. October 6th, 2023, WeWork files for bankruptcy. This is not, by this point in the story, a surprise. The company had struggled through the post-IPO collapse, the COVID-19 pandemic, which devastated the flexible workspace market precisely because the pandemic required people to work from home. a brief and doomed SPAC merger that took it public in 2021 at a valuation of approximately $9 billion, down from $47 billion, continued losses, debt payments it couldn't sustain, and the gradual acknowledgement that the fundamental economics of the business were not going to improve their way out of the hole they were in. The bankruptcy filing listed approximately $18.6 billion in liabilities. The company that had been valued at $47 billion in 2019 owed more than twice that amount and had essentially nothing in terms of equity value to show for it. Thousands more employees lost their jobs. The landlords who had signed long-term leases with WeWork found themselves holding contracts with an entity in bankruptcy proceedings. Contracts whose favorable to WeWork terms were now a liability rather than an asset. During the 4 years between Neumann's departure and the bankruptcy filing, the story of WeWork became something that American culture processed in real time. 2 major documentaries, Hulu's We Crashed and Apple TV Plus's WeWork, or The Making and Breaking of a $47 billion Unicorn, examined the rise and fall in extensive detail. We Crashed dramatized the story with Jared Leto playing Neumann as a kind of charismatic prophet-turned-wreckage, which is approximately what the documentary record supported. The shows were watched by millions of people who had never heard of community-adjusted EBITDA and came away with a fairly clear understanding of what had happened and why. The cultural processing served a function. It turned WeWork from a financial story into a cautionary tale, with characters and drama and emotional resonance. That transformation is how a story becomes durable enough to change behavior, not just in the investment community, which had already absorbed the lesson the hard way, but in the broader culture's understanding of startup valuations and venture capital dynamics. Adam Neumann, in the years after his exit, did not disappear. He took his $1.7 billion exit package and launched a new company, Flow, a residential real estate venture focused on, and here you are permitted a moment of incredulity, creating community in apartment buildings. The company raised $350 million from Andreessen Horowitz, one of Silicon Valley's most prominent venture capital firms, at a reported valuation of over $1 billion before it had significant revenue. The reaction in the business community to Andreessen Horowitz's Flow investment was a mixture of disbelief, dark amusement, and genuine philosophical unease. This was a bet on the same man whose previous company had destroyed $14 billion of investor capital, whose governance behavior had been extensively documented as problematic, and whose concept for the new company bore striking thematic resemblance to the one that had just imploded. A16Z's Marc Andreessen published a long memo explaining the investment on the grounds that Neumann's WeWork failures had given him unique and hard-won insights into the residential real estate market. This argument is not entirely without logic. There is a school of thought in venture capital, a legitimate one, that founders who have experienced catastrophic failure and survived learn things that cannot be learned any other way, and that the right founder with the right lessons from the right failure can build something extraordinary the second time. Amazon's Jeff Bezos, before becoming the most successful retailer in history, had backed and lost money on multiple early internet ventures. Steve Jobs was fired from Apple and spent 12 years building Next before returning. The resume of failure is not automatically disqualifying. But the specific nature of WeWork's failure, the governance issues, the self-dealing, the treatment of employees, the deliberate inflation of the company's self-description, raised questions that were about character and judgment rather than business strategy. These are harder to learn your way out of than a wrong market bet. Flow's progress, as of the time of this story's telling, has been limited. The residential real estate market has not been transformed by Adam Neumann's second act. Whether it will be remains an open question that time will answer. What is not an open question is what WeWork revealed about the system that built it. Let's do what good stories are supposed to do at the end. Let's figure out what it means. WeWork was not a fraud in the legal sense. Adam Neumann was not convicted of securities fraud or financial crime. The company's financials, as disclosed, were accurate. The losses were real, the lease obligations were real, the cash burn was real. The S-1 was a terrible document,
but its terrible numbers were the actual numbers. What WeWork did was not lie about its finances. It lied about what its finances meant. It told a story in which the numbers were merely inconvenient waypoints on the road to inevitable dominance, and it found investors willing to believe that story for long enough to accumulate an investment base of $18.5 billion. The distinction between lying about numbers and lying about what numbers mean is important legally. It is less important morally. The people who lost jobs and options, and in some cases savings, did not benefit from the distinction. What WeWork really represents, what the story illuminates most clearly, is the danger of a specific kind of belief system that the startup ecosystem had been constructing for decades. The belief that growth is strategy. The belief that a large enough vision, projected with sufficient conviction, is a substitute for unit economics. The belief that the right founder, in the right room, with the right story, can raise enough capital to outrun the laws of business gravity. That scale and speed and narrative can delay the moment of reckoning indefinitely. This belief is not entirely false. It contains truth. Amazon lost money for years before its financial structure clicked into the most profitable machine in retail history. Netflix burned cash for over a decade before streaming economics produced margins that justified the investment. The venture capital model of backing founders with large visions and long time horizons has produced genuine value that a more conservative, near-term profitability-focused model would have missed. The problem is not the model. The problem is the absence of discrimination between the companies where the model applies and the companies where it doesn't. Amazon was losing money because it was investing in infrastructure that produced compounding returns at scale. Warehouses, logistics networks, AWS servers, where each investment genuinely improved the economics of the next. WeWork was losing money because each new location was a new version of the same bet, and the bet did not improve with repetition. The losses were not investments in compounding returns. They were the cost of a business model whose unit economics had a ceiling. That distinction requires the kind of analytical discipline that the WeWork era, at its peak, did not reward. The discipline was there. The people who read the unit economics and shook their heads were right, and they were right years before the S1 made it impossible to look away. Being right in private markets in the 2010s was not enough. Being early was not enough. The social and financial dynamics of the ecosystem had created conditions in which seriousness was a disadvantage and belief was a currency. WeWork changed some of that. The post-2019 venture capital environment became, by every measure, more focused on unit economics, more skeptical of narrative without numbers, more willing to ask the obvious questions in the rooms where Neumann-like founders gave Neumann-like presentations. The down rounds and restructurings of 2022 and 2023, as interest rates rose and the easy money era ended, accelerated that shift. The phrase path to profitability became not just acceptable, but mandatory in investor conversations. The culture changed. Not enough, not permanently, but measurably. Rebecca Neumann, for her part, launched a company called Summer, described as a reimagined summer camp experience. She has spoken in interviews about the lessons of the WeWork years in terms that suggest a genuine reckoning with what happened. Whether that reckoning is complete or performing is not something an outside observer can determine. The employees who lost stock options and jobs have, in many cases, moved on to other companies. Some of them have spoken publicly about the experience, the idealism with which they joined, the moment when the story stopped holding, the layoff calls and the healthcare cancellations, and the sense of having believed in something that turned out not to be what it said it was. Their accounts are the human texture of a financial story that is otherwise told in billions and percentages. 3,000 people, 20% of a workforce. Lives interrupted, plans disrupted, trust violated. Not by an accident or a market turn, but by the deliberate construction of a story that was always more about the teller than about the truth. Here is what Adam Neumann got right. The way people work is changing. The rise of the gig economy, the growth of remote and hybrid work,
The preference among younger workers for environments that feel intentional and alive, rather than fluorescent and anonymous. These are real trends, and WeWork identified them before most of the real estate industry understood what it was looking at. The product was genuinely good. The spaces were genuinely better than conventional offices for a lot of the people who use them. The idea that physical workspace could be designed to facilitate human connection rather than simply contain workers is not wrong.
There is a version of WeWork, a smaller, more disciplined, financially honest version that could have been built and sustained. A company that grew at the speed its unit economics could support, that raised capital at valuations its actual business justified, that treated its governance obligations to employees and outside investors as seriously as its obligations to the founder, that told investors what it was, a better real estate subletting company, rather than what it wanted to be, the physical manifestation of a revolution in human consciousness. That company would have been worth several $billions. It would have served hundreds of thousands of members. It would have employed thousands of people in stable jobs with real equity value. It would have been a successful, legitimate, durable business. It would not have been $47 billion, and Adam Neumann would not have been on magazine covers as a visionary, and Masayoshi Son would not have made a 12-minute decision to write a check that would become one of the largest losses in investment history. And the story would not be told today on YouTube channels as a cautionary tale about the intersection of charisma, capital, and the specific human capacity for believing what we want to believe about things we've already decided to be true. The dream WeWork sold was real enough to attract believers. It was not real enough to survive contact with the one thing that dreams eventually always have to face. The numbers. $3 billion lost. $14 billion from SoftBank. Thousands of jobs. A company in bankruptcy. A founder with $1.7 billion and a new venture. The dream costs something. It always does. The question is, who pays the bill? At WeWork, the answer was everyone who wasn't Adam Neumann. And that, more than any specific accounting entry, is what this story is actually about.
If you enjoyed this episode, click the subscribe button to get notified when we post new content.